Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to Ad Age Remotely. I'm Janine Poggi, Senior Editor here at Ad Age, and today I'm joined live by Lenny Stern, founding partner at SS+K. Hi, Lenny.
How are you doing? Good morning, Janine. Thanks for having me.
I'm good. Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
So Lenny has worked on political campaigns for Democratic presidential candidates from Walter Mondale in 1984 to Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. So thank you for joining us today to talk a bit about what's going on this crazy election cycle and get some insights from you there.
You bet. I'm excited to share any thoughts I have, but with the one caveat that people, so-called experts know everything and they know nothing. And I am certainly in both of those boats.
Where are you working from in these days?
Currently, I am in my home office in Chappaqua, New York, in Westchester.
Has the office opened yet? Do you have employees going in yet?
You know, we are partially opened according to the CDC and city and state guidance and are following all best practices based on science. People are given that opportunity, but most people are working from home. You know, and when we think about the work situation, someone a lot smarter than me said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think those businesses and companies with strong cultures are able to navigate these tougher, more complicated times. And how you go back reflects that culture. And being really careful, looking out for your people, investing in the long-term health, both physically and emotionally, in how you approach the situation is something that we're trying to do.
I remember when you were on our Ad Block podcast, it was like right around this time, I think last year, and you were talking about during Hurricane Sandy when the office closed down. I guess it was for a couple of months. Could you imagine then, you know, what it was like then and being like we were a virtual, you know, agency then and what it is today?
No, and you know, Janine, as our agency has a history in politics, and we've taken those political lessons and have applied them to brands and businesses going through change. One thing we've learned from politics is to be agile, quick, integrated, team-oriented. So I do think experiences like Sandy, sadly, but also just our culture has allowed us to navigate this in a pretty effective way.
What do you think is the future for office space? Do you think post-COVID you'll return to sort of what was considered normal pre-COVID, or how are you looking at office moving forward?
Well, you know, I think the overused hyperbole is the new normal, and I do think people have learned how to work quicker, more efficiently, more effectively in some ways, and that's going to take those lessons. I also think ultimately businesses are about culture and about taking care of your people, and more people may have needs and desires to work in different ways. And I think in the past, some companies were reluctant to break norms. And I do think what's gone on now will allow people to understand that you can provide different, more flexible situations for people and be very effective for your clients.
When do you think you'll start feeling comfortable or ready to start like traveling and, you know, doing the lunches and dinners with clients and all of those kinds of things?
You know, I wish I could answer that, but what I would say is, you know, we're big believers in following the science, listening to our people, and that's what will drive our decisions.
Yeah. So for anyone watching at home, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on our social channels and we will try to get to them during this conversation. So let's talk politics. So, you know, what are some of the themes emerging from this, you know, election cycle, and how does it compare to 2016?
Sure. Well, to state the obvious, when you're looking at the race today, and again, with all the caveats of me not knowing much more than anyone else, you have to look at where America is today. And sadly, we face four major crises: a health crisis, an economic crisis, a social justice crisis, an environmental crisis. And these are things that are dramatically impacting people every day. They're feeling it. So that is at a backdrop. And as a result, it's no surprise an important backdrop number is you always look at the wrong track, right track of how Americans are thinking about it. And that number is 29% right track, 64% wrong track. So that's a significant backdrop to this race. Another one is just the division we all experience and feel. And that is something that is weighing on everybody as we think about this election. The last thing is something that we've talked about a lot as an agency with many of our clients is this is truly a hope and fear election. And you know, what is happening is you have a lot of people hoping for normalcy, for decency, for empathy, for facts, for truth. And you have a lot of people fearing the chaos, the division, the selfishness, and that dynamic is the backdrop. And that kind of leads into how this is different than 2016. You know, people say if you don't learn from your past, you're doomed to repeat it. So let's think about 2016 before we talk about 2020. One is, as I said, the country are facing these unprecedented crises that are really touching people's lives. So that is one dynamic that's different. Two is Trump is now a reality versus a fantasy. And what I mean by that is 4 years ago, people all saw in Trump what they wanted to. Now there's a 4-year record which people are experiencing. Third, there is a much less polarizing Democratic candidate. Say what you want about Hillary Clinton. It's not about liking her or not. The reality is she was very polarizing. And Joe Biden's likability numbers are much stronger than hers and much stronger than Trump's. And that's a different dynamic. And then fourth, you have this dynamic about the turnout. We're going to talk about that. And there's right now indications of an unprecedented enthusiasm. You know, average people vote in a presidential election around 59%. Estimates are now at around 65%. We've seen 14, 15 million people who voted already. And also the last point is there's not third-party candidates. So those dynamics are different. And I think as a result, you see a different situation of where we are today and what might happen.
Let's talk about turnout a little bit more. You know, what are you thinking the effects of the pandemic will have just on voter turnout?
You know, I think life and politics in the end, people say all politics is local and all local politics is about humans. And I think, unfortunately, sadly, what this pandemic has done and what these other crises have done is force people to face significant challenges. And some people think about stakes of an election of like, well, does it really matter? I think people really believe now. You hear people saying, I'm voting it like my life depends on it. And as a result, you see some dramatic, interesting dynamics. Look at seniors and look at young people. Mm-hmm. Seniors traditionally vote for Republicans. And in 2016, Trump did better than Hillary with seniors. And now those numbers have flipped. Why? Because they're scared. They can't see their grandchildren. So to your question, it's directly impacting them and it's shifting a voter block. Secondly, young people. Young people are among the most impacted by COVID. Their lives have been turned upside down, job situation, unemployment, etc. So you see many of them being driven, and sometimes young people get accused of being sort of lazy or cynical that it matters. But I think what you're seeing now by the numbers are indications that they really are going to come out in a strong way. And lastly, communities of color have sadly been dramatically disproportionately affected by the pandemic, by the economic situation, by public health issues, other public health issues, by environmental issues, and of course, social justice issues. So this is another group. So I do think the impact of the pandemic and these crises is going to drive turnout to a much higher number than 2016.
Let's talk a little bit more about the younger demos. How have the two campaigns been doing as it relates to reaching younger voters?
Well, I think the way to think about it is historically, sometimes people believe young voters are driven by a person. She or he who or they who inspire them, a movement, if you will. And a lot of people point to 2008, 2012, and Barack Obama as an example, and that can be true. But also, I think in this election, interestingly, what's driving young people is the stakes of the election. Maybe Joe Biden might not be the most inspiring. Maybe he was not the first choice for many young people, but the stakes right now and the last 3 years have, I think, pushed young people to understand that their vote does matter and it is significant. So one thing that is driving them, and I think the Biden campaign has been pushing it, is to remind people what is at stake at the ballot box: justice, safety, health, truth, science, climate safety and change, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is, I think authenticity matters to young people. And I think the Biden campaign, again, whether you're inspired by Joe Biden or not, I think everybody understands he's a very real, decent human. And Uncle Joe is sort of, you understand that what you're getting with him. And I think young people respect that, even if it was a grudging respect. And then lastly, you're seeing the campaign utilize third parties. They're utilizing Bernie Sanders. They're utilizing Elizabeth Warren. They're utilizing Michelle Obama. They're utilizing Barack Obama. So you're going to see third parties also activate young people in a big way. And I think, frankly, on the other side, Trump is a bit of a one-trick pony. He knows what he knows. He did it well in 2016. He's applying the same way to do it. So he's using fear and sort of his notion of strength as his calling card. And frankly, that plus where he stands on the issues that matter to young people, I think is putting him in a difficult position. The big question with young people is not who they're going to vote for, it's turnout. As you probably know, Hillary Clinton ticked quite a few points lower than Barack Obama, and that may have made the difference in those 4 swing states that flipped for Trump. The question now is can youth turnout move a point, 2 points, 3 points more? It could make the difference. So
do you believe that these issues will help drive that turnout, that these will be enough to bring young people to the polls?
I do believe. I think you're going to see all indications are of a very significant turnout. Like I mentioned earlier, there's close to 15 million people who voted already. People in Georgia waited 11 hours, some people, to vote. And they sat there and they said, you know what? I'm voting like my life depends on it. And I don't think that's just for young people. I think it's for senior people. I think it's for people of color. And I think it's many groups are going to come out in bigger numbers. And again, I reference some of that is historically works for a Democrat, but seniors and women are voting so dramatically right now for Biden. And I do think you're going to see large turnouts across all those demographics.
I'm Janine Poggi, and I'm here with SS+K's Lenny Stern. Thank you to those who are watching at home. Hello to Jonathan Adams, Charles Reeves, Dimitri Corgildes, James Dwyer, and Jim Signorelli. Thank you so much for tuning in. So Lenny, when we last spoke to you, when I just spoke to you last year, you had suggested that the numbers this election cycle weren't going to work out in President Trump's favor. Do you think that's still the case?
Yeah. Yes. For those of you who are bored and want to listen to that last podcast, I also predicted the Jets.
That was entertaining. Bored. It should be part of your morning routine.
No, I also predicted the Jets would be 8-8, so I was bad there. But I did say at the time that I thought in the end Trump would lose, and I still believe that. Because let's look at a few dynamics here. One is, weirdly, in this chaotic, crazy world over the last year, for a long time, the numbers have been very stable. January of 2020, Joe Biden was up by about 6 or 7. Early September 2020, just a month ago, Joe Biden was up around 6 or 7. Very stable. The second thing is, while everybody said, yeah, but Hillary was too, her numbers were always in the low to mid 40s and Trump was in the high 30s. Even though it's been a stable 6 or 7, Biden's number have always been higher. He's been in the higher 40s, tipping into 50. So that's a difference. Second thing is what happened over 15 days. First and foremost, you had a debate and a debacle. You had what some people believe was the single biggest train wreck ever that happened on the stage. You had, sadly, Justice Ginsburg's passing and the Republicans' quick movement and hypocritical action to turn around and do something that they wouldn't do 4 years ago. You had you had the vice presidential debate, which really didn't change much. You had the president's diagnosis of COVID and his actions during that process. During those 12 or 15 dates, what you saw is those stable numbers dramatically moved statistically. And suddenly that lead of 6, 7, or 8 went to 9, 10, or 11. And there's a poll today that just came out, the NBC Wall Street Journal poll has it at 11. So that's where things are at. But as people will ask, yeah, but national numbers don't matter. It's all about the electoral college. And that's right. But if you go underneath those numbers, what you see is in the key battleground states, the blue wall that flipped for Trump, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the numbers that were 3 or 4 for Biden have now moved to 5, 6, or 7. In the new sort of swing states of Arizona, you see again the numbers that were tied moving several points to Biden. In states like North Carolina, in states like Iowa, in states like Georgia. So what you've seen in those battleground states, even Ohio and Florida, those states are all in play, and they've all moved with the national polls. And again, the reason they're moving is seniors, women, those demographics are dramatic. And then what you're also seeing is even white working class voters who are still voting for Trump, or even men who are still voting for Trump. His margins are much less. So the movement has been pretty significant over the last week and a half. The battlegrounds are moving, and the key demographics are moving.
At this point, could anything, or do you foresee anything that could potentially flip it back or change the trajectory right now?
Of course. I mean, if you've learned nothing from American politics, is anything can happen. Overused October surprises. Remember, we just heard about Access Hollywood 4 years ago, just about at this time. Jim Comey didn't reemerge till a week or so from now. So many things can happen. But look, if I had to point up to the things that could change this, is one, turnout. And what I mean by that is, look, if in fact Trump's base turns out and the young people don't, people of color don't, and the voter intensity, because Trump still has significant voter intensity. So turnout's going to be significant, and that's something to watch. The next thing you have to watch is everything around voter security and integrity. You have situations popping up every day. In California, the Republican Party is throwing out fake ballot boxes. The governor of Texas is trying to constrain how many ballot boxes there are in counties. You saw in Georgia, a Republican establishment creates dynamics and situations that make it harder to vote. So those sorts of things can change things. And ultimately, this race may tighten, but those are dynamics that could move it. Because again, Trump lost the popular vote in 2016 by close to 3 million votes. Joe Biden is either going to win the popular vote by 3 million or as much as 6 million. If he wins the popular vote by only 3 million, I think you can see a close election because of some of the issues I just raised. If he wins by a larger margin, I think you're going to see a cleaner victory for Biden. And the last point is, if it does get close, I think the notion of, election day becoming election week or election month, and when that happens, dirty tricks can happen, court cases can happen, and the Supreme Court could get involved. So I do think there are things that could change it. But if you're pushing me real hard, the internal dynamics indicate that it shouldn't happen.
I want to get into more of that in a minute. We have a question from Maurice on Facebook. What is the major change for political marketers who saw the polls miss the prediction of the last election's results by such a large margin?
Well, I think it's a great question, Maurice. Two things, just because it's always fun to say this. If you look at the polls the day before the election, whether it's Fox News, ABC, in 2016, they all predicted a Hillary Clinton win between 2.5 and 4.5 points. She won on election day by 2.5 points. So honestly, the national polls were not so wrong, but what they did wrong was they were focused on the national race and not looking at the state polls. And they were not looking at states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And the Clinton campaign was not traveling there, and they stopped polling the month before. So I think, what did they learn? They learned A, track the state polls. B, weight them properly. And what do I mean by that? The sample size, you weight by Democrats, Republicans, independents, but you also weight by demographics. And I think by all estimates, pollsters underweighted non-college educated men in the last election, and they fixed that. So many of the pollsters have adjusted. The focus is more on the state polls. But again, you can't fight this year's war with last year's sort of plan. So no doubt they've tried to figure that out, but no doubt they're missing something. So that's part of what is still the unknown.
Let's go back to the conversation around election acceptance. As you mentioned, we go from election day, election night, potentially to election week, or we don't know necessarily how long that could drag out. What do you think is the outlook for election acceptance? No matter which way it swings, that whoever wins the election will be accepted as such.
Well, look, I think there's two ways to look at it. One is sort of in the macro way. This country is divided, angry. It's hard to disagree with someone without hating them. And we all have our stories about that. And there's lots of stories about civil challenge and civil unrest coming out of it, and big groups of people in America being very upset with those results. So I think what's going to happen is, how do we as a country, and how do our institutions, and how do individual leaders show up when that moment happens? And do they show up with decency and country first attitude and humanity? And or do they revert to the sort of demonization partisanship? I believe what will happen is there will be unrest and disappointment and anger. But I think big institutions, whether it's leaders of both parties, military, media, independent, nonpartisan organizations, will coalesce around the people's voice. And I think if the right people coalesce, not to be pejorative, but it's like parents. The country model their behavior on folks. And if what is being modeled by the leader is chaos, division, and question it, and I believe that's what Trump has done, we're going to have some big problems here. But if people and larger institutions across the aisle accept the results early, quickly, and support it, I think that disappointment will be managed. And America is an imperfect place, but it's a great place, and we will move on to a better place.
Do you think we will know who will win on election night?
The popular view among prognosticators, there's one school of thought of strap yourself in, it's going to be a long night, week, month. There's something called the red mirage. The early numbers will come in on election day of those who voted election day, because more Republicans vote on election day. So they may look like a close election or Trump advantages. It's going to take a longer time to count ballots. There are some states that are allowed to count before election night, but there's some that not. Some are used to it, like Colorado and Oregon. Some are not, like Pennsylvania. So I think if Biden wins by 3 to 4 million popular vote, I think it's going to be a long night and a long week. However, there is a belief that because of turnout, he's going to win by 4.5, 5, 5.5, 6. And if that happens, and states like Florida, which you may know early, flips, and states like North Carolina, which you may know early, flips, you may know much sooner. And in fact, the Raging Cajun James Carville, who's a lot smarter than me, but he is also a little hyperbolic, and I love him for it. He believes everybody's going to know by 11 o'clock, and it's going to be ending early. So that's a little bit of both sides of the coin.
Any early takeaways for political marketers this time around in comparison to, how things were going in 2016?
I think for marketers in general, as creative people, who many people on this phone, on this live stream are, story and an emotional narrative is so important. And I think this election just reinforces that. There's the old sort of story construct of villain, victim, hero, solution, etc. And I think in 2016, say what you want, but Trump had that down. His villain was the elites, the establishment, others, immigrants. The victim was the forgotten white working class, the people who, the silent majority. The solution was, make America great again, the wall, so on and so forth, trade, and he was the hero. This time around, if you're being honest, he has no story. It's, Joe Biden's old. Wait, Hunter Biden. No, it's the suburbs. They're going to be taken over. So he's been all over the place. Where Biden has been quite focused. He said when he announced that this is a fight for the soul of the country. He's running about bringing decency back, normalcy back. He's focused on building back better, and that is a notion to building back more justly, more equally, talking about social justice, etc. So I think this election tells us one, story and emotional and a focused narrative is super important. The other thing I would think it would tell you is great creative cuts through. And I think a lot of organizations, whether it's the Lincoln Project or other independent organizations, there's a great organization, More Than a Vote. Full disclosure, we've been, proud enough as an agency to work for, to recruiting poll workers and getting out to vote. Those organizations that who aren't necessarily one of the candidates are out there with creative, powerful messages about getting out to vote in this election. So it's the age-old story. Have a good story, be focused, and be creative about it.
Thanks, Lenny. Thank you for joining us, and we'll check in with you in a couple of weeks, right, to see what happened.
Yeah, hope I'm right.
Thanks to our Ad Age crew, Alfred Mascaroni, Anna Sekula, Max Sternlicht, and Elise Liffring for making this live stream happen. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.